Hi, I'm Raihan, and I'm here in Los Angeles with Vice, and I'm about to meet Larry Flynt, pornographer, rebel, godless heathen, political activist, and so much more. Let's go. Mr. Flynt, thanks so much for inviting us into your office. It's incredibly generous of you.
All right, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, was there a moment when you were a kid when you decided that you were destined for extraordinary things?
I think I was about 10 years old, and I was sitting on a swinging bridge across the river in eastern Kentucky. And you gotta understand, our biggest industry down there was jury duty. You couldn't get a job anywhere. And I just felt that there was more to the world than where I was living. I felt I wanted to be wealthy because I was so poor then that I felt that success was measured by money. Now I realize that success is not measured by what you got, but it's measured by the obstacles you had to overcome in order to achieve them.
Was there a particular person when you were 10 who inspired you, or someone who came from the outside world, someone who kind of gave you a bigger sense of the world outside of eastern Kentucky?
My role models were really world leaders and politicians and people like that, rather than actors. I was influenced a great deal by President Kennedy.
Kennedy is a guy who grew up in great privilege, and someone who, I suppose you could say, used that privilege to go into public service and devote himself to a larger cause than himself. But I wonder why it was Kennedy who sparked that enthusiasm in you, given that he came from a very different kind of background.
I don't have a good answer for that, other than when he would speak, I used to get goosebumps.
Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
And I always thought he was so profound.
I would love to know, I mean, the Obama presidency began with tremendous enthusiasm. And I wonder, as someone who is a great devotee of President Kennedy, do you think that President Obama has proved to be up to snuff?
I think President Obama has overperformed. I know this has become a cliche, but it's so true. He got handed on his platter when he became president more than any president in history ever had to deal with. I'm just amazed. He hasn't done everything perfect, you know, he made a few mistakes along the way, but I think he's done a marvelous job.
When you say he's overperformed, is there a particular quality that he has that you think accounts for that?
I'd say him and Jack Kennedy have the same intellect in terms of being smart. I think that's been his best asset. But now, you know, you gotta understand that when he was trying to do business with the Republicans on the deficit and the debt ceiling and all that kind of stuff, he was just one man fighting everybody to try and get a deal.
Did you ever think that you'd go into politics? Did you ever think you'd run for office?
No, but I've always been fascinated with politics, and I actually think that I know more than most people do about the political status of our nation.
You recently announced a challenge, a kind of bounty. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, in every presidential cycle for the last 30 years, we've run a full-page ad in the Washington Post where we offer a $1 million reward for anyone that can provide information on their politicians.
Have you paid out the $1 million in the past?
Oh yes, we have a number of different. Sometimes they've had to split it up because there've been more sources than one. There's nothing that will change someone's moral outlook more than cash in large sums.
Indeed. Huh.
You know, and I don't think because you pay for information that it's any less credible.
You're not just a political activist, you also are someone who built a mammoth, innovative publishing empire. And I wonder, what was the innovation? What was your key insight?
I was successful not because of what I did, but in spite of what I did. I did not know the publishing business. Neither did I read magazines like Playboy and Penthouse. But when I had a chain of clubs in the Midwest, and somebody said, why don't you do a club like Playboy did? And so I looked at the magazines, and I just realized, hey, if they want to buy a car, want to know which car to buy, they'll buy another magazine. If they want to know how to mix the perfect martini, you know, they find out from the local bartender. You know, they really want to know about girls, and they want to see pretty women. And that's more or less the philosophy that I applied to Hustler, is that if you look at Playboy, it's obvious that Hefner likes blondes with big boobs, Amazon-type girls. You know, to Hustler, you don't know what I like. Like we, you know, small, medium, large, we have brunettes, redheads, blondes, whatever. It's the girl next door look. You might see a girl in Hustler that reminds you of a girl you've seen at the laundromat or something.
What was the initial inspiration to go into opening these clubs and sort of basically going into this business of, you know?
Well, when I got out of the Navy, you know, I didn't have a trade, I didn't have a lot of formal education, so the easiest business for me to get into would be to go in the bar or club business, and that's what I did, and that's how I got started.
Where did the original money come from? Was it just your savings from the Navy?
Oh, I worked in factories, GM factories in Dayton, Ohio, and I saved a little money, and the first bar I had was only a beer bar. You couldn't even serve liquor.
And this was in Dayton?
Yeah. You know, and then I continued to expand into other cities in Ohio.
So, in recent years, obviously the rise of the internet and internet pornography has been a huge challenge to a lot of those established publishing empires. And I wonder, I mean, have you ever felt under siege by it? Have you ever felt like this kind of world that you had built was really being shaken up?
I first took notice in the 70s when VHS and Betamax came along. I felt, you know, that definitely was going to take the adult movies into the home. And then in the 80s, as the internet started to come into focus, I felt, you know, the industry's changing and I better change with it. So I put up my first website in the early 90s.
Do you ever miss that world of the 70s, back before VHS and Betamax and adult movies came into the home? Do you ever miss that world where people had to go to movie theaters?
I miss it because it was
district?
a lot more simple. Well, it's not as people think that the world is simple today because you have all the gadgetry and the internet and everything, but life was much more simple then, and there's a certain yearning.
Was there a camaraderie there? I mean, in those clubs in Dayton and everywhere else that you were building up, and you know, where people were going to peep shows and going to adult movie theaters. I mean, was there a spirit that you miss in those places, or is that an overlay?
I definitely do. Those are my fondest memories. The early years with Hustler and building Hustler up. But then, as I was saying, but I continued to diversify. I went into the gaming business. We have probably one of the most successful casinos in California, about a half an hour south of LA, which is very profitable.
There are a lot of people who fret a lot about how accessible pornography is and how the easy availability of pornography has really changed relations between men and women. Do you worry about that at all? Do you think that it's changed things for the worse, or do you think it's changed things for the better?
I think it changes it for the better. One thing that pornography does that people don't realize is is it desensitizes people because one of the biggest problems in relationships now is premature ejaculation on behalf of the man. Well, upon viewing pornography and being exposed to pornography, it takes that immediate impulse away, you know, and you're not as apt to be so quick.
Although, I wonder, I mean, when you were growing up in Eastern Kentucky, say when you were in your early teens, was there an excitement around forming those early attachments, those early relationships with girls that isn't necessarily there for today's teenagers?
I think possibly they may be a little bit more promiscuous today than there was then. As the religious right would try to get you to believe, they attribute this to pornography.
But it's also true that there are a lot of folks, a lot of feminists, who've given you a pretty hard time and who've been very hostile. And I wonder, do you think that they just have it wrong? I mean,
You know, when they would criticize me about pornography, they say I was exploiting women. What I was doing was demeaning to women. That's like saying that Sports Illustrated exploits sports, you know. That's what I was selling. I've never, ever had a woman pose for the magazine and say that she was coerced into doing this or she felt she was being exploited, you know. That's just the feminists coming up with their own brand.
there was a moment in the late 70s when the evangelical movement was really on the rise, and there were a lot of people who had never been a part of it really got drawn into it. And my understanding is that in the late 70s, there was a moment when you yourself embraced religion. Do you remember that? And what was it that led you there?
I got over that.
Well, what was it though, like back
Well,
then? Because you were already a pretty
well,
successful entrepreneur at the time. And
I did have a very profound religious experience. And most people, when they have this born again type experience, the average person has nobody to talk to. They don't want to go to the doctor because they don't want to be perceived as being mentally ill. So the only thing they can do is talk to a member of their family or a neighbor or something, and they're directed to start going to church. So that way you're already caught up in the religious sect. But I sought out a psychiatrist immediately after it happened to me.
it's funny that it led you to the doctor, because most people, when they feel that warmth, they would welcome it rather than go to the doctor.
My psychiatrist simply told me, he said, look, he says, we know nothing about the brain. He said, even brain surgeons don't know anything about it. He says this is largely thought to be because of a iodine deficiency in your diet.
Do you think that that more devoutly religious Americans would be less devoutly religious if they just ate more salt?
He showed me a whole map of the world that shows where stronger iodine deposits were in the salts, you know. And there was always a higher degree of manic depressive people that lived in those particular areas. So he says there's definitely a correlation between the iodine in the salt and the manic depressive and, you know, and the use of lithium as treatment.
How did that change things, that experience of having faced death?
Somebody asked me once, they said, what's it like to be in a wheelchair all these years? I said, you know, I don't know. I never thought about it until you asked me. I don't dwell on things I can't do anything about. So that in a nutshell tells you the type of person I am. I don't waste time dealing with things that I can't solve.